Exciting lineup for this afternoon. Okay, our next panel is going to talk about Revolution 4.0, challenges for education, productivity, and employment. We have four guests: Orlando Ayala, who spent 35 years in technology, 25 of those at Microsoft, and now is a special advisor to the President of Colombia on productivity and employment. We have also with us Claudia Costin, who's director and founder of CEIPE, which is a foundation in Brazil at the Getulio Vargas Foundation. It's a think tank at the Getulio Vargas Foundation. We also have Montserrat Gomendio. She's head of the OECD Centre for Skills. And finally, Stela Campos is the career editor at VALOR Econômico. And this panel is going to be moderated by Stela Campos. Ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming Revolution 4.0.
Thank you. Hello, good afternoon for all. Well, I think I can start this panel telling you a little story. Since Oxford University in 2013 report estimating that 47% of jobs at US were at risk of automation, and they listed 70 occupations that could be replaced. I think the future of jobs become one of the most studied topics all over the world. Everyone heard something about the future of jobs. This year, the World Economic Forum estimated that 75 million jobs may disappear by 2022 as companies shift to automation. But they say 133 million of jobs might be created. Jobs that comes from integration from machines and humans. So, as we know, technology is advancing fast, so we have robots, artificial intelligence, and all this. And the big question is, are we preparing workers, upskilling and reskilling to face these times of changing? Is the education system responding to these new demands of the labor market? And what is the role of governments, companies, and society not to leave millions of workers behind? So, to address important issues and the views to these hot topics, we have this excellent panel with very prestigious people. I would like to introduce a little bit more of these people for you to know. I'll start. Montserrat Gomendio, she is from OECD Centre for Skills. She also works to support the Secretary General's strategic orientation in the area of skills with the aim to help countries strengthen employability, social participation, and inclusiveness. She was Secretary of State of Education, vocal training, and at universities at Spanish Ministry of Education. And by the way, she studied management program, but she also has a PhD in behavioral ecology, and she has formed in biology. So a very interesting profile. And Claudia Costin, she's Brazilian, just like me, and she was the founder and director of the Center of Excellence in Innovation Education Policies, a think tank she started at Getulio Vargas Foundation, which is a leading private university in Brazil, where she teaches. And she was recently a visiting scholar at Harvard Graduate School of Education. And she was a senior director for global education in the World Bank. And also, she has a very tough mission. She worked as a Secretary of Education, the municipality of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. And also, just to finish, there's lots of things. She's dedicated, she was in the Global Commissioner on the topic, the future of work from the International Labour Organization. Thank you, Claudia. And Orlando Ayala is, well, advisor from President of Colombia, as he said, but he has more than 32 years in IT industry. So he has more than 20 years at Microsoft, and where he was vice president for emerging markets, and where he helped federal, provincial, and local governments, I guess, to develop the digital infrastructure, educational programs, human resources needed to turn their particular capabilities into international competitive advantage. Is it correct? And so he is that very close team from Bill Gates, no? Yeah, the leading team from Microsoft. So you're all welcome. Well, I think the big question, as I was telling, that we can start this conversation, is are we really preparing the workforce and with this, the people with the skill set we'll need for the labor market of the future? Who wants to start? Well,
Shall I start?
Montserrat.
So what we know is that in most countries, the technology is having a big impact on labor markets. Now, the estimates that we have at the OECD are a bit more optimistic than the one you gave. So our estimates show that 14% of the jobs, on average, there are huge differences between countries, are at risk of being fully automated, so they would disappear. But another 32% will be profoundly transformed because the tasks that only require routine, low skills will become automated. So those jobs will not disappear, but they will become much more demanding. What does this mean in terms of the demand for skills? It means that people will need much higher levels of skills in order to get a job, and they will need a new set of skills, skills like complex problem solving and critical thinking, which was shown in the previous presentation. Teamwork, creativity, adaptability, and so on are becoming increasingly important. And then finally, also a major implication is that traditional education systems need to evolve into lifelong learning systems. By this, we use a really broad definition, starting with early childhood education and care, going through compulsory education, tertiary, all the way to adult learning. So the whole system needs to be redesigned so that people are really prepared to continue learning throughout their lives so that they can adapt. If their jobs disappear, they can upskill and move to a safer job. If the job is experiencing a profound transformation, they have to avoid being displaced from that job, so they will also need to upskill and reskill throughout their lives.
So when we think about companies, what the whole of the companies in upskilling, reskilling the workforce, if they're more automated, there would be time for workers to learn more, or that's not?
Well, if you allow me, let me just make a reflection about this. I think the real challenge goes way beyond reskilling workers. I think it does because I am convinced the world is living one of the most challenging times in the history of humans. For the first time, there's 3 vectors that are converging in a massive way. And I say that because I think the question comes more with how do we educate the workers of the future, and how we educate basically those workers that are going to create jobs in the future. But I'll say 3 things converging massively. Number 1, a tech convergence of the scale, speed, and impact we have never seen before. And we heard a lot of this morning. This is in the context of also the largest divergence of geopolitical and economic models in the world. We are close, in my opinion, to a breaking point in many places because the known world that was sitting on globalization, connected supply chains, is basically being changed dramatically. So those 2, lots of convergence in technology, a lot of divergence in socioeconomic and political ones. And then the third one, and I'll answer the question, has to do with a lot of phenomena on demographics. A lot of aging, that brings a whole set of challenges itself. There is a lot of challenges with a new generation with different type of expectations. And most of all, on demographics, one thing that I think is the biggest challenge is, I believe, the ethical construct of the world is challenged right now, and it's going to be challenged to the core. Why? Because basically, we are not anymore 7 billion people. I think we are at least, right now, 11 billion people. Why? Because every one of us, every day, has a parallel eye that is digital. This morning, that parallel eye that is digital has been producing information, and today, you have no control of that digital eye, which is your parallel next door to that. So, forgive me for starting right there, because I think the challenge is a lot deeper in the context of how we think about these challenges of educating at a time where all these trends are converging in a real bad time. Not to say on the demographic side, I am very concerned about that. There's a big movement, basically, of people from rural areas to the cities. The cities cannot take more people anymore. There is not enough jobs to do that. So I just wanted to answer that way, and we can go back to the specifics of the companies, what they need to do. But I would say, first and foremost, the biggest education challenge is broad, not only for people, it's for politicians and everybody else, and it goes around how we think about a new ethical society around this technology convergence.
So, Claudia, would you address something, the government policies about education? What is the challenge? You see the companies, the governments in education right now.
Okay, if I start with the developing world perspective, or let me be even more specific about Latin America. There are two challenges linked to what Orlando has just said. One is the fact that in Latin America, learning is not happening. And for the 20th century, I'm not talking about the 21st, kids are not learning to read and write properly. We are not able to read newspapers and extract information as we should. Colombia has improved recently, but still has a long way to go. In PISA ranking, we are at the bottom third of the ranking. And we will need to develop the skills needed for the 21st. At the same time, the world won't wait for Latin America to first do the 20th century skills, and then later, when we are ready to develop digital education and the other skills that we need for the future. So this is a challenge, but it could be also an opportunity. Because if we develop a sense of urgency, and we create contemporary curricula that deals with what differentiate us from quote-unquote robots, we can take advantage of the time as long as we do the hard work of educating every child. Because what will happen with the children that don't get the skills needed is that they, first, there won't be jobs for people that have just very low-level skills. And if they do, inequality will even grow bigger and bigger. That's what everything is projecting for, everybody is projecting for the future. So we will have to do the two things together. And yes, critical thinking, as Montserrat had said, is very important to teach them critical thinking, to teach them learning to learn, as the Minister of Spain had mentioned this morning. Learning to learn has become really urgent because young people in the future will have to reinvent themselves in successive ways, because it's not that all jobs, present jobs, will be disrupted all at once. They will be destructed in successive waves while other jobs will be created. And transition problems will happen. So kids now will have to learn to be able to reinvent themselves. And to finalize my first comments, is that it's also urgent to make humanities important again, because robots, as far as we know, at least till the next 20 years, are not able as yet to think systemically, to understand what makes us human, to develop empathy, and even to have a creative, to solve problems creatively and collaboratively. And we need the human face there, and our kids needs to be ready for this future.
Montserrat, as OECD has a lot of studies about, are some countries more prepared than others to face these challenges of digitalization?
Well, absolutely, because there are two major differences between countries. I think the main one is what is the level of skills of the population today, and how inclusive that is. So how widespread is it that people have high or low levels of skills? And there we see huge differences between countries. Some countries have really high levels of skills. They're also very inclusive, so most of the population have those levels of skills. Other countries or regions, you mentioned Latin America, have, in comparison, a very low level of skills. So they are ill-prepared for the challenges that lie ahead. But if I may add, one of the other questions that we've asked is, okay, so technology is creating these challenges and this disruption. To what extent can technology itself help us solve this by helping the education system and the lifelong learning system and so on? So our data are not exactly what we expected. We see that in many countries, governments have made a huge effort to buy laptops or other devices and send them to the classrooms. When we look at whether this has an impact on student outcomes, student performance in PISA, for example, it does, but it has a negative impact. And the reason is that they have only concentrated on buying the devices. They have not done enough teacher training. So the teachers are not ready to know how to incorporate the technology into the classroom, because we do have many examples of schools and countries where when teachers are really trained to introduce the technology into their teaching practices, student outcomes do improve. But so far, they are exceptions. If you look at adults, adult learning, and you look at the use of online sources such as MOOCs and so on, there what we see is, again, not what we expected. We expected technology to be able to make the system more inclusive. And what we see is that it's creating a huge divide. So highly skilled people use all the resources available online or wherever to continuously upskill so that they acquire higher and higher levels of skills. All countries have a major issue with low-skilled people who do not have the motivation to engage in any form of learning, including MOOCs and other online resources. So this is really creating a big gap between the highly skilled and the low skilled that we really need to address.
For example, the MOOCs that are very popular, most of the users are young, employed, and very qualified young people, so not many adults, that ones that are going to be off the market, are using them. So do you think that what are your experience bringing the technology to other countries as a way of education?
Yeah, I believe that never before the way to learn and educate has been challenged, especially with one technology that is coming up in a massive way, and it's artificial intelligence.
Yes.
We need to understand the implications of that way beyond of how you consume content today. The reality is that in previous revolutions, people that were displaced were mostly people in manual laborers. What is common is that the biggest missile to attack the jobs in place today is an algorithm. And algorithms today are basically designed to replace almost instantaneously what white-collar workers do, which is take information, process the information, and make decisions. Well, algorithms are incredibly strong in doing that capability. So I have introduced that concept because I do believe that we should not look just at how people is consuming today content, but think about how artificial intelligence is being used. This morning, Ferguson talked about China. The biggest experiment in transformation of how you consume content is happening right now in China. And it's basically, if you allow me, in four spaces where it's being transformed. In-class training, test and grading, in-class training, second, homework and drills, third, test and grading, and four, custom tutoring. Why I say those are the four spaces? Because what happens is this technology that is coming up that has the capability to listen, learn, even smell, in-class training could be actually as effective as somebody or a machine looking how a student is reacting to what is being presented by the teacher and automatically putting his profile just by his reaction if this kid is understanding or not understanding. So imagine the implications of that, not only on how people consume content, then go to basically homework and drills. You take the in-class, then you take artificial intelligence to basically tailor the content for the student and basically test the student in-house trying to do it and then suggest ways to correct it. So my answer to that one is I think that countries that are just looking at the current ways of producing content and the current ways of just consuming content are going to be left behind. This artificial intelligence capability is very close to have really the power to teach and communicate in a more effective way.
Well, I would like to add, now you're talking about teaching. We have to talk about the teachers.
Yes.
Are we preparing the teachers for 20th century? We see in developing countries like our country, for example, Brazil, we have it's a difficult career to convince someone to become a teacher because they don't have low salaries, not prepared. It's hard to develop. How do we prepare the teachers for the future?
So, yes, I was going to bring the teachers into the scene because you can have the best equipment. With children, you need, children and adolescents, you need good teachers. And Montserrat mentioned this very quickly. You can have the best top-notch technology. If you don't have a good teacher, it doesn't get incorporated into the classroom. And we have a challenge in many countries to attract high schoolers or upper secondary, as in Europe, in some countries you say, to the teaching career. So we need to attract talent, and this you do through three things. First, yes, salaries matter. Doesn't have to be the upper career as far as salaries are concerned, but you have to give good salaries. Second, you have to make it hard to get into the teaching careers. If you send a sign that everybody can study education, it's an easy university or area to get into a university, and you don't provide social value to the profession. It must be for the top students. Colombia has built some incentives on that front, but Chile had gone even further, making it, you have to have a very high grade in the national exam at the end of high school to be admitted into their teacher's college. And third, you have to have social recognition and not pity towards teachers. Unfortunately, sometimes we treat teachers as if they were somebody to be lamented. They work under such difficult conditions, and not somebody who is entitled to have pride on their achievements or their practices. Second, you have to prepare them for the teaching profession in a different way than we prepare, not only in Latin America, but in Africa or even in some countries in Asia, where what we teach in university is completely disconnected from what they are going to do in their careers. When we prepare a doctor to become a doctor, since day one, they are in the hospital that is connected to that medicine school. In education, no. Sometimes it's only at the final stage of your university, of your college, that you go to a school. You have to connect to practice. And third, and not less important, in an era, at an epoch where it is so urgent to teach how to learn, teaching learning to learn, teachers should be lifelong learners. We have to teach them to have passion for learning. If they don't have it, they won't instill in the children and adolescents this love of learning that many of them, unfortunately, do not have. So we have to rethink teaching, not only preparing them on some crash courses to use technology, which is also important, but teaching them to love learning, to be passionate about their careers and passionate about learning.
And I think the way we teach must change, because the traditional way we're teaching at classes, you have lots of young, connected teenagers who are disengaged about studying. Yeah. And how do we engage these people again? How can we put them in the same page? And how we put adults in the same page?
Well, again, I think technology can help there, because the most routine part of the teaching is actually giving the traditional classroom lecture. Now, students can get that information from the laptop, and that would save time for teachers to concentrate on the teamwork, on the complex problem solving, on the creativity, and all those issues that are much more difficult to teach. But going back to what Claudia was saying, I mean, what we know about teachers and their skills is that one of the skills that most teachers in most countries are not very good at is complex problem solving. Because traditionally, this was not part of the training they got at university,
so complicated,
nor has it been part of their experience in the classroom. So it's really important to prepare the next generation of teachers, but it's also very important to devise ways to upskill and reskill the teachers that entered the profession 10, 20, 30 years ago. There's still going to be teachers for a long time in most countries, and they really need to change their teaching practices, and they really need to acquire new skills. First, the skill itself, whether it's complex problem solving or critical thinking, and then the way to teach that to other people. So,
can I make a comment on that?
Yes, please.
Yeah, sorry. Sorry, I woke you up. No, I just wanted to say that I think teachers are and will continue to be extremely important in the model. The most promising thing that these technologies are bringing, especially artificial intelligence, is the fact that it could truly free up the teacher from the tedious tasks. Yeah. And for instance, tests and grading takes a long time. And you know, today, through artificial intelligence, you can test and grade almost 90% of what you have to test and grade. So in my view, the transformation of the teacher, number one, will be there will be a lot of great enthusiasm for technology to help doing the boring parts, important but boring, and then focus on the creation of content and experiences. So teachers will need to turn themselves into great experts on using these technologies. Virtual reality, augmented reality, all of these amazing tools that can be so immersive, so actually they spend the time on tutoring and creating great, amazing, engaging content. And that's the great thing that's happening with this technology. That said also, imagine that artificial intelligence also, real time, is building the profile of the student, live. Because these cameras are actually analyzing how the kid reacts and helps the teacher basically build a profile that actually can give 2 tips to the teacher on what to focus on just by seeing the reaction of the kid if he's understanding or not understanding. So I want to say, very important, teachers are going to be more important than ever, but their role is going to move to be free them up from the boring stuff and make them great creators of content experiences for engaging the students.
Can I build on that, please? So I believe that first, pedagogy matters a lot. So to prepare teachers for a more engaging classes, and what you mentioned about boring tasks makes a lot of sense. Now technology can be a helper if used in the correct way. It doesn't disengage the teacher from the task of understanding each child or adolescent, each one of her pupils or students. And there is one more thing that I think we need to emphasize, including from what we heard this morning, which is about social and emotional learning. You cannot have classes on social and emotional learning done in the traditional way, empathy. Empathy is the ability of. You have to develop those skills in the teachers themselves, because if a teacher is not empathic, she will never be convincing in preaching empathy that kids see that are not present in her. You have to really make her develop that skills. And so part of the upskilling of teachers is pedagogy, part is, yes, digital education, and part is developing social and emotional skills in the teacher to build resilience, to deal better with mistakes, to deal better with persistence. If a teacher gives up on her student, the student will give up on his or her learning. So those are important points.
Who should be responsible to form this new teacher we'll need for the future? The governments, or must the teachers be an autonomous learner like we all must do in the future? What do you think?
What we find is that in most countries, governments are always in charge of defining the standards and sort of other accreditation and recognition systems. So that's very important, because that signaling system tells you, say, how good someone has to be able to study education at university, or how good, or what skills someone needs in order to become a teacher, right? Now, in those countries where teachers are already highly skilled, they are given a large degree of autonomy so that they can develop their own innovative practices. And this is the case of Finland, but this is the case of Singapore and many other top-performing countries. When teachers still have a very low level of skills, and they're still not capable of developing their own innovative practices and creativity, then they need a lot of support through professional development. Just to give you an example of the country which has been the top performer in PISA for a long time, and it keeps improving, which is Singapore. Now, the difference between Singapore, the top performer in PISA, and the lowest performing country in PISA, I won't say which one, it's equivalent to 7 years of schooling. We're talking about huge differences in quality. Now, what is one of the many things that Singapore does differently? Teachers spend more time in the Academy of Teachers learning themselves new innovative teaching practices, new skills, and so on, that they spend in the classroom. Now, how many countries can afford that? Whether this is scalable, that's another question. But this has worked, and this is the way forward, even though other countries may not be able to take it to that extent.
Well, and if we can imagine the best way to educate the workers in the future, what would you say we should start?
Well, sorry, I come from technology, so I would say technology is a big way to do that. And maybe I should refer to, answer that question to the challenges I see as really core to the whole of society, but for enterprises themselves. I think a lot of the competitiveness of enterprises is going to come from their ability to create differentiation in services and products, to great creation of very competitive algorithms. Basically, there's very little around that today that you train a worker for. And the reality is that if you want to transform a business, the algorithm itself is the one that creates that capability to create new products and services that are highly differentiated. So how do you train against that, number one? Number two, how do you train a set of people on how you manage the ethics of the creation of an algorithm? How do you ensure that an algorithm is actually not discriminating people? There's a series of big questions around that. So the answer today would be, yeah, technology will provide MOOCs and self-training, and many corporations do that. But truly, the biggest challenges we have in front of us is that the whole world is being transformed by these technologies that are converging. A lot of that has to do with the creation of differentiation through creation of algorithmic capability at the institutional level, and we have very little to train for on that, especially on how you manage an ethical way of creating new products that are based on algorithm capability when we just don't have that basically in the market. I don't think universities are producing that today. So the challenge is very broad in that sense, but I guess technology can help a lot too.
And how do you see, Claudia,
Well, before I talk about the workers, let me go back to your question on who is responsible for changing the way teachers are addressed in society. And I think it's both public policy, as Montserrat has mentioned, but also civil society. Governments respond very well to good civil society pressure. If we want to change things, citizens are capable in democracies to react to good pressure. So they are good at pressuring governments for change. And having good education policies is very important and even urgent. On the workers' front, one thing that I would think about is connecting more education to professional education within the companies or even outside the companies, because in this period, in this era where people would have to be reskilled and upskilled frequently, having advisory agencies on skills, governmental or civil society organizations devoted to counseling workers on skills will be very important. Not only training, but counseling. Where should I get, or in what capacity should I get reskilled, or what is the next profession that I have to look after? Will be an important point.
So when we talk about skills, you talk about collaborative skills, you have critical thinking, but we all must learn a little bit about technology, as you say. How technological must we become to face the challenges we have in the future labor market?
Well, it's an excellent question, because I think that the definition of digital skills, at least within the OECD, has changed a lot. So we used to understand digital skills by meaning that a person was able to use a device and certain software. No longer, because so many people have access to that, and it's become so user-friendly that it's really not very complicated for people who have had access for some time to learn by using, basically. So now we use a different definition of digital skills, which is how efficient people are at solving certain tasks in a digital environment. So just to give you an example, if you ask someone to perform a task with a computer, the main problem is not so much whether that person, at least in OECD countries, has experience with a computer, because most people do, both at school, at work, and at home. Whether those people are familiar with the software, because most people are, or it's really easy to learn. But how efficient are they at not getting lost in the vast amount of information that's available through the internet? So what we see is that when you ask people to perform a task in a digital environment, highly skilled people are very efficient. They will know where to look for the information. They will spend just enough time in each site to get the relevant information and move on to the next step until they get the task done. People with low levels of skills, the problem is that they get lost in this vast amount of very complex information. So they're not very efficient. They look in the wrong places. They spend too much time, and they can't finish the task properly. So.
Yeah, there's an observation on that I think is important to think about the replacement of jobs. People tend to think this job is going to disappear or that going to. I think that's the wrong way to look at it. The reality is that many jobs, or parts of those jobs, are the ones that are going to be replaced. And in that sense, companies will need to think about that. Let me give you an example. Aviation. In the cockpit, there used to be 3 people. One was called the flight engineer. Well, there's no flight engineers anymore, right? So that's gone, and that was gone gradually. Now, automation is coming into the cockpit. And there's a point where, it's no doubt in my mind, the airplane is going to be able to take off and land itself without trouble, and the pilot will be there just in case. So there are many questions about what do you do with that pilot sitting there? Should that pilot earn the same money now that he's just sitting there basically watching the machine doing all of that? All of these are elements that you have to think about at the time you think of reskilling, because it's not a one-to-one swap. It's going to be gradual, and certain jobs are going to be displaced halfway, and then how do you deal with the fact that maybe wages are going to be depressed because now that person is not doing all the things that that person used to do. Now a machine does part of that job, so what do you do with that? So it's a very broad, challenging thing where technology can help, but at the same time can be a big challenge for companies to rethink about the model, how to reskill people.
Okay, well, we almost finished, so unfortunately, I have one final consideration by each one of you. About the challenges for the future, what do you expect could be the education in the future? What do you dream about?
So I think the question that most people ask is this technological revolution going to have a positive or a negative impact? And the answer, I'm afraid, is it depends. It depends on whether you prepare people by equipping them with the right skills well in advance, and then you will turn the challenge into opportunities for all. But if people are not prepared because they don't have the right skills, then the impact will be very negative.
Okay.
Well, very quickly, let me share with you then my utopia. Independently of the changes that will happen, I dream of a system where every child learns with high expectations for every one of them, which means combining excellence with equity. And also that teachers may be respected for their practice, not out of pity. And that inequality is not reinforced but through education. Unfortunately, nowadays, education systems reinforce inequality instead of fighting it. And finally, that education really prepare each student, each pupil to autonomy, the dream of Montessori, of Dewey, of Paulo Freire from Brazil.
Okay.
Technology is like a hammer. You can kill somebody, or you can build a beautiful house. And the only thing I can tell you is the following. The biggest part of the revolution coming in is the incredible capability of technology to personalize the learning experience. That's the biggest single most important thing that's happening, where a student can be empowered with no limits on a personalized way of learning and absorbing and discovering, and the teacher too. The side of the hammer that is very dangerous is how do you manage that personalization in terms of privacy, security? How do you not abuse ethically the fact that data is out there of that student and teacher, and you are basically not crossing that line in which you put technology in front and you basically pay by making the humans less humans or being invaded by technology. And that's the biggest dilemma we have in front of us. Let machines be machines, and let humans be humans.
Okay. Thank you very much. Just very interesting. Thanks a lot for all the panels. Thank you all for accepting this. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much.